the timeline we looked at in relation to chapter 17, 18 and 19. And we noted that there was to be a 50-year period between the return of Christ and the opening of the kingdom. In the first 10 years, you have a number of events that take place: the resurrection and the judgment, the marriage of the Lamb as Christ takes his bride from the redeemed saints, and then Armageddon, all of that in the first 10 years. Then there is the call to submit, which is given 10 years opportunity, the destruction of Rome, and then 40 years of eradicating Catholicism from the face of the earth, and in subduing those nations that have previously rebelled against God. And that gives you the 50 years that we covered in chapter 17, 18 and 19. And all of these chapters up to 21 verse 8 are part of the seventh vial. These are the judgments of the seventh vial, which end in chapter 21 and verse 8 with the second death. So we're looking at tonight the end of the history section, and we're going to see the end of those things which were predicted right down to the end of the 1,000 years. And when we come to Revelation chapter 20, and we'll deal with chapter 20 first, we have a number of events which we're probably familiar with from our learning of the truth, but perhaps there's some things here we can actually expand our understanding of. So in verse 1 to 3 of chapter 20, we have the binding of Satan, the devil, and the dragon. And those are all synonymous terms for the power of human lust, human thinking, which opposes God. We then have in verses 4 to 6, the saints given authority to rule in the millennium. Chapter 7, verse 7 to 10, we have the rebellion at the end of the millennium, which is a most interesting topic and often generates questions. And then at verse 11 to 15, the second resurrection, the second judgment at the end of the millennium. And then we'll go on and we'll look at chapter 21 as well. So we come to this section about the binding of Satan. We read in verse 1, I saw an angel come down from heaven. So here is heavenly authority imposed. The angel represents Christ and the saints, and Christ has the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And remember, we're dealing in symbol here. So this is what we're looking at when we deal with the symbol, because he's going to take hold in verse 2 of the dragon, the old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and to bind him 1,000 years. So we need to identify which power is going to be bound, cast into the bottomless pit and locked away for 1,000 years. And it is the power of thinking that is natural to the flesh, and it has various manifestations through the Bible. We start off in Eden with the old serpent, or the original serpent, the thinking of the flesh that was allowed to offer an alternate viewpoint to God. Remember, the woman said, God has said. And the serpent said, well, I think, which was the natural mind at work. It's amazing how often you hear people say, I think, instead of saying, God says. So the old serpent is the natural mind, the thinking of the flesh, right from the beginning. The devil means the false accuser. This is where flesh decides that God is unfair, God is unreasonable, or God doesn't exist. And the most classic illustration of the devil at work is found in Psalm 10, and it ends up in verse 13, where it says that the mind of the flesh says God doesn't care, God will not judge me, I can do what I like. And it's a false accusation against God. So the devil is that which misrepresents God, either saying God is too hard or God doesn't care, and so justifying do what the flesh wants to do. Satan, of course, is the adversary, opposition to God and his laws in any form. People can be Satan like Judas or Peter, or it can be organisations that actually oppose God as well. So again, that which opposes God based on the thinking of the flesh. When you come to the dragon through the Bible has many different phases, but the dragon indicates organised military opposition to God. So these are all the things that man has built around over the centuries to oppose God's laws, God's ways, and God's kingdom. And it's going to be bound for 1,000 years. Human thinking will not dominate the world as it has in the past for so long. And so we're going to see these various forms of opposition, sinful human nature in all its manifestations, locked up for 1,000 years. They will not have control and power anymore. Now, when we come to this section of Revelation, We have in Revelation chapter 20 a fairly unusual part of the Bible, because we have a mixture of literal and symbolical. On the literal side, we have a literal 1,000 years, and I will explain that in detail in a moment. When you see 1,000 years here, we don't have to convert it, it's literally 1,000 years. We have the persecution of the saints, which literally happened. The saints now ruling, which will be literal. The first resurrection, the saints acting as priests, the nations rebelling, the beloved city, Zion of the age to come, fire from heaven, the second resurrection, the second death and the abolition of death. All of that are literal events. But we have a mixture in chapter 20 with symbolic things as well. And we need to differentiate between that which is literal and that which is symbolic, because we have an old serpent, devil and Satan, an angel with a great chain, a bottomless pit which is then locked up, a beast in his image, the mark of the beast, Gog and Magog, the sand of the sea, the lake of fire and brimstone, tormenting forever. Is there eternal punishment? Well, no, it's a symbol for something, isn't it? The great white throne and the books of judgment. So these are symbols that we have in Revelation chapter 20. Now, the majority of these you can find by going back through the Bible, and in the notes you would have received, you will be able to see some of the references to actually source where these come from in the Bible. But I want to just show you the meaning of those symbols. So when we put the symbols and we understand them, what they're indicating, alongside the literal, the chapter becomes very simple. So the symbol of the old serpent, devil and Satan, fleshly thinking in power, in control. The angel with the great chain. Now, these actually on the back of one of your pages, you have these couple of PowerPoints anyway. The angel with the great chain is Christ and his saints in control, with the ability to lock away the thinking of the flesh for 1,000 years. The bottomless pit, well, that indicates something which is where you are banished. It's somewhere you can go into and you can't get out of it. And are powerless, it's sealed up. So the thinking of the flesh, the power of the flesh to organise against God is restrained. The beast in his image we know is the Catholic apostasy. The mark of the beast, the acceptance of the papacy, the worshipping of their crosses and idols. The Gog and Magog, organised armies. And you're going to see in this chapter that Gog and Magog are actually symbolic rather than the land of the Gog and Magog like you get in Ezekiel. So it's a symbol for organised armies against God. The sand of the sea, which of course is from the Abrahamic promises and in other places in the Bible, it indicates huge numbers of mortal beings. Total obliteration, the lake of fire and burning brimstone. Nothing survives a lake of burning brimstone. Total obliteration, never to be seen again. Tormented forever and ever indicates eternal disgrace and shame. So always people remember, when something is tormented forever and ever, they will always be held up in ridicule as time goes on, that look what those people actually did. So that's where the beast and the false prophet and the thinking of the flesh are going to end up, eternally disgraced and shamed. The great white throne, of course, again, Christ the righteous judge, and the books of judgment are symbols of God's infallible memory. Now, all of those you can trace through the Bible. Some of them we will deal with in some detail. Most of them, I'm sure you can find them when you go looking for them. So we have to differentiate between where it's literal and symbolic, because we have a mixture in chapter 20 particularly. So I want to come now to this 1,000 years mentioned in verse 2. Now we very rightly would ridicule a Jehovah's Witness who would quote Revelation to say that there's 144,000 that go to heaven, because that's what the JWs do with Revelation chapter 14. They say the 144,000 are special privileged JWs who when they die have immortal souls and they go to heaven as spirit creatures. And we would mock them and say, well, it's a symbolic number, because it says there's 12,000 of this tribe and 12,000 of that tribe, and we would make fun of them with that. But we have to be able to explain, if they came back at us and said, but you believe that the 1,000 years here are literal. And we've got to explain why we believe the 1,000 years is literal and not a symbolic number. Because almost every other time period we have in Revelation, we actually convert it in some way to a historical period. And sometimes we do double and triple conversions to get there. So why do we say that 1,000 years is literal? And I think this is a really important piece of information which you may not be aware of. Now, in chapter 20, the only place in Revelation where that word years in the plural occurs. It's the only time in Revelation you get this word. And it emphasises 1,000 years. And you find it in verse 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. So it's a commonly repeated phrase, but it's the only time you get this word in Revelation is here in Revelation 20. And it's the plural years. Now notice that, the plural years. There's another year that gets mentioned in Revelation 9 verse 15, and it's a different word in the Greek. And it's there part of the description of 391 years, where you have a year, a month and a day all put up as eventually building up to a period of 391 years and 1 month. And we've done that conversion in our past studies in other times. However, that's a different word, and it's not a plural word. So just take that on board. Every other reference in the Bible to 1,000 years are literal years. Every other reference. Psalm 90, Ecclesiastes and Peter all talk about 1,000 years, and it's always a literal number of years. And this is the most significant point. In all Bible prophecies, which are given in years, they are literal years. In the case of Abraham, thy people shall be a stranger 400 years. The destruction of the faithless generation, they shall wander 40 years. Jeremiah 25, the time of the captivity will be 70 years. And again, Jeremiah 29, 70 years. Ezekiel 29, 40 years. All of those time periods were literal years. So it's a consistent theme of the Bible that when you get years, it's always literal. If God wants to use years as part of a symbol, he uses the word times. So you get times and a dividing of time, which is actually 3.5 years or 1,260 days. So whenever God wants to put a symbol and use years as part of a symbol, he uses the word times, not the word years. So there's your key to explaining why we take this literally, because it's consistent with every other Bible prophecy that when you get years plural, and this unique word that only occurs in Revelation 20, then it's a literal number of years. If it had said for times here, then you'd have to go and start do conversions. But it's a literal number. So there's your evidence, and that's on the back of your sheet as well, so you can actually get that in your Bible. So if you ever get a Jehovah's Witness that challenges you why you're taking that number literally, then you have an explanation. It's consistent with the way the Bible is written around the word of years. And as you probably know, in Revelation, we're not going to go through this. It's quite a complicated slide, but we're not going to go through it. I want to just note the comment from Brother Graham Pearce on the right-hand side. Because in Revelation, when God is giving you symbolic things to represent time periods, he actually uses a number of days, hours, months, which is relevant to the symbol he's used. So when you have locusts, you have 5 months, which is about the normal cycle of locust plagues. When you have treading down, it's 42 months, because it's representing 1,260 years. When you have dead bodies, it's actually reduced, the 105 years is reduced to 3.5 days, because a body won't last 105 years. So again, the decorum of the symbol is what determines the number of conversions you need to do to get to the right number of years. And likewise, you can see the woman fed for 1,260 days or 3.5 times, the beast speaking for 42 months. You only need the one conversion. So it's always related to the decorum of the symbol, that you're not going to have, for example, a beast speaking for 1,260 years, but it can speak for 42 months. And that, of course, then converts to the number of years we're looking for. Brother Graham Pearce says this: if the symbol is an earthquake, then the time element is appropriate to an earthquake. In the same hour, there was a great earthquake. It would be inappropriate to have a symbol for an earthquake for a year, because earthquakes don't last a long time. If a ravaging wild beast are the symbol of then a time of 1,260 days is appropriate. It would be incongruous to have a wild beast active for 1,260 years, because beasts don't live that long. So the conversion you need is related to the decorum of the symbol, or the appropriateness of the symbol. So that's just something to take on board and to think about. And that's why when we come to Revelation, the 1,000 years is given to us as an exact, precise number. Okay, well, this is a quote which we're very familiar with, been used in lectures for decades in Christadelphia, but never loses its power. Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, writing about the early Christians, said this: "The ancient and popular doctrine of the millennium, that is the 1,000 years, kingdom on the earth, was intimately connected with the second coming of Christ. That was the original belief of the apostles and those that followed them. As the works of creation would be finished in 6 days, their duration in the present state would be affixed to 6,000 years. By the same analogy, this long period would be succeeded by a joyful Sabbath of 1,000 years. And that was the original belief of the Christian movement. When the edifice of the church was almost completed, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, when they brought in the doctrines of hell, heaven going and immortal souls, the doctrine of Christ's reign was rejected as the absurd invention of heresy and fanaticism. And so the doctrine of the millennium got thrown out the door by the corrupt church. But there it is in history. This was the original belief of the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we can be sure that we're still on confident ground when we follow them in that belief. So what happens then in verse 2 with the binding of the serpent power? Satan bound 1,000 years, cast into the bottomless pit, shut up. What does that mean? Well, it means that in the kingdom, there will be forced control of human nature. So it can't assert itself like it does in so many places in the world today. We're told there'll be no rain on the disobedient. We're told that the saints will be able to read people's minds, just like we find when you go through the Bible. You know, people knew other people's thoughts because they had the power of the Spirit. Peter knew what Ananias and Sapphira were up to without being told. Christ knew what Nathanael was doing under the fig tree without being told. So the saints will have the power to know what they're thinking. And when they start thinking the wrong thing, we'll say to them, "Excuse me, this is the way, walk ye in it." And there will be a control of human nature through the kingdom. A word behind thee, tap on the shoulder. That's not what you should be doing. And that will be the regime of the kingdom. There will be a strong level of control over human nature so it doesn't organise itself against God like it has for so many hundreds of years. So that's what it means, Satan being bound 1,000 years. A seal upon him, that is the key, the seal. Christ will make sure that this is enforced. Because it says in verse 3 that he should deceive the nations no more. And that's what the flesh has done ever since the Garden of Eden, deceived the majority of mankind into thinking they can do what they like and God will not care. But we have there in verse 3 the hint that that will always be a time when they are given one last chance and they will come out of the bottomless pit. Okay, well that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a binding of human nature for 1,000 years. A suppression of the will of the flesh to the laws of the kingdom. And then verse 4 to 6, we have the saints in power. Now this is not talking where it says, "I saw thrones and they sat upon them and judgment was given unto them." It wasn't that they were being judged. It was that they now are the judges. They have the authority to be kings and priests and to make decisions for the mortal population. And you notice in verse 4, this was the reward of those who had suffered under the hands of the false church. They were beheaded for the witness of Jesus. They had not worshipped the beast or his image or received his mark on their foreheads or hands. You know, this is, brethren and sisters, the distinct reward for those who gave their lives for the truth, who utterly refused to go along with church doctrine and suffered the consequences. God has forgotten not one of them. And they are particularly pointed out as those who will rule the earth and subdue human nature. And then we find in verse 5 something which often people find odd, where it says, "But the rest of the dead live not again till the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection." And we need to just make a little correction here, because That phrase, and if you haven't got this in your Bible, get a pen and mark in verse 5 a bracket around the word before the word but, and another one after the word finished, because it's what we call a parenthesis. It's an aside. It's an explanatory note, and it needs to be just read straight through without it. If you read straight through, they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy that hath part in the first resurrection. On such the second death hath no power, and they shall reign with him 1,000 years. So you've got to see that that is a parenthesis, that is an aside, it's an explanatory comment, because later on there's going to be another resurrection and another judgment. And it's just making a little note that this is not the only one. So as the arrow indicates on the screen, it's particularly, this is the first resurrection, relates to the end of verse 4. The explanatory note has to be seen as an aside. And you can check that with the Net Bible. It has it very clearly in brackets. And I believe some other translations likewise would support that. So there it is, brethren and sisters, the wonderful hope of the saints, to live and reign with Christ 1,000 years. Blessed and happy is he that hath part in the first resurrection. And that's what all of us have the opportunity to be in. And then we come to verse 7 down to verse 10, and we have this worldwide rebellion. And almost every time you have a question night or a School of the Prophets, it came up recently in Perth School of the Prophets, same question came up. How can there possibly be a rebellion at the end of the kingdom? Well, brethren and sisters, human nature will still be there in the kingdom. There will be divine laws, there will be strict control, but human nature does not change. So how can it be? Well, you'd think after 1,000 years of divine government that people would be refined and ennobled and in grateful submission, but they won't be. They will have enjoyed longer lives, perhaps living great ages as they did before the flood, because disease and sickness will be reduced in the kingdom. A child would die at 100, we're told in the book of Isaiah. But it also says sinners will still be there. So again, you're going to have human nature will still be there. But by the end of the 1,000 years, it will be a new generation. Nobody will be around that actually saw the coming of Christ and the Battle of Armageddon. They will all be in the grave, awaiting the second resurrection. So it's going to be a new generation. And we're told in verse 9 that the saints will actually remove themselves from all the places in the earth where they have been ruling as kings and priests, where they've been controlling the nations. They will come back to Zion, to the camp of the saints, to the beloved city, and leave them on their own. And so we read in verse 7, when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison. So God will now take away the direct control. They will have an opportunity to now decide whether they're going to continue to serve God without enforcement or whether they'll do their own thing. And human nature again deceives them in verse 8. Human nature will rise up to deceive the nations in the four quarters of the earth. I want you to notice that the whole globe is now involved. Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of sea. And whenever you get sand of the sea, it's always talking about the people on the earth. They went up on the breadth of the earth, compassed the camp of the saints, which means to completely surround it, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So let's just talk about why this could possibly happen. When the saints are withdrawn from controlling the world, disobedience will no longer be punished. Secret gatherings will be held. You know, this deceiving will go on. People being convinced that they can overcome the saints, resenting the rulership they've been under for 1,000 years, and then organising a military force to attack Zion. And you see, that's what's going to happen. A worldwide rebellion. You're probably familiar with this verse because we use it a lot in lectures. And we normally quote verse 9 because it says that when God's judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. What that means is they will all be obliged to obey. it doesn't say they'll all be converted. They will learn righteousness. They will have to know what it is. They'll have to do what God says. Because it goes on to say in the next verse that there will always be some who will not be converted. There will be some who will say, we will not abide this any longer than we have to. Let favour be showed to the wicked. He will not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness, he'll still deal unjustly. And he'll not behold the majesty of Yahweh. And that's what's going to happen at the end of the kingdom. They would have learned to live under the law of righteousness of the kingdom. But if they haven't been converted, if they haven't really learnt what righteousness means, then they will rise up as this predicts. And now I want to quote to you a wonderful quote that Brother John Martin gave to me many years ago from his experience at an American Bible school, when Brother L.G. Sargent was asked this very question about how could a rebellion be possible. And I think this is a wonderful answer. The rebellion at the end of the 1,000 years is certain, not only because it is clearly predicted in the scriptures of truth, but also because it is a theological necessity. Now, that's a big word. A theological means something about God and God's principles which is logical. A theological necessity. If all that God has told us about human nature is true, then we can fully understand flesh rising up in this way despite centuries of righteous rule. And I think Brother Sargent really nailed it in that comment. And again, that's in your notes. So I'd recommend you put that in your Bible somewhere in your space around Revelation 20, because it's a brilliant explanation of how this can possibly happen. So the timeline of Revelation 20 is quite simple. The 50 years, Revelation 17, 18, 19, that we've already seen. Then we have 1,000 years. And then we have what is called here a little season in which they were able to do this. And we don't know how long that little season is. We've made some guesses. Some would say it's a 50-year to balance the other 50 years. But really, we don't have any proof of how long the little season actually is. But we do know that after that, there will be this rebellion at the end of that little season when they've had time to get organised, to build themselves armies and weapons, and they will be loosed for the little season you read about at the end of verse 3. And they will then attack the camp of the saints. Fire will destroy those armies, completely obliterate them, and then we move on to the second resurrection and judgment. But who are the people that are in this particular rebellion? Well, when you go to Europe, you see a lot of strange things. And in some of the buildings in Europe, you have these statues of Gog and Magog. And of course, they print them here as warriors and sort of leprechauns. They are common symbols that are used in Europe. We know that in the Bible, in Ezekiel 38, you have Gog and Magog, but it's the land of Gog and Magog. Gog of the land of Magog. So it specifically relates to Russia and Europe in Ezekiel 38. I believe this is not strictly limited to Russia and Europe in the future, because they come from all directions. In Ezekiel 38, Gog and Magog come from the north. Here they come from the four quarters of the earth against Zion. So Gog and Magog now become a symbol of the intention to destroy the land of Israel, the temple, and all of those things that relate to the people of Israel. The same intention, the same evil thought that you read in Ezekiel 38 of the literal Gog and Magog is now brought up into this revelation. And of course, it will include Europe and Russia. So look at the difference. In Ezekiel 38, when Gog is destroyed, all the nations will know who Yahweh is. Well, these people have known Yahweh for 1,000 years, and they still rise up in rebellion. So Gog and Magog is used as a symbol of those powers who organise themselves into armies to attack the saints. So Gog and Magog will be there. And they will come from the four directions of the earth to attack the Holy Land, and particularly the temple site in the Holy Oblation. So they're type armies that will encompass the camp of the saints. And it's another military invasion of God's land. So again, we have this attack. Well, we read in verse 8 and 9 that fire comes down and it devours them. And this, of course, is very much after the pattern of Sodom and Gomorrah, when destruction fell from heaven. And you might be aware of Brother Lane's recent posting about the fireball type arrangement that came, the solar flash, whatever it was, that came and destroyed Sodom. It's a very similar thing. Fire coming down from God and completely wipes out these armies that have surrounded the holy oblation in the land of Israel. So there's the end of the rebellion. Dramatic, final and complete. And then we read in verse 10, and the devil that deceived them, so that is the thinking of the flesh that falsely accuses God, is cast now into a lake of fire and brimstone, which is total and absolute destruction. And when it gets there, when human nature is finally and totally to be abolished, to have no say anymore in the earth, it joins in that total destruction the beast, which is the armies that rose up against Christ in Revelation chapter 17, and the papacy that's been there since they were destroyed. They're already there. They are there. And it's in the past tense, where the beast and the false prophet have been for 1,000 years. And they all go into total and utter oblivion and into eternal shame and disgrace. That's what it means when it says tormented day and night forever and ever. There's not God going to be, poking people with pitchforks and fires for forever and ever. God's not like that. That's a symbol for not only absolute destruction, but always being held in contempt forever and ever through history. And in the memory of all the saints and the immortals, they will say, look what God did to human nature, the papacy and the beast. That's the contempt that they will be tormented forever and ever. So, that's the end of human nature. That will be the last chance they have to rise up against God. But we need to ask the question, why does God plan that to happen? Here's God's kingdom. Why does God say they will be given this charge? Well, it shows us and teaches us that human nature, even under ideal conditions, will naturally want to resist God. That's just built into our nature. Romans 8 verse 7 says the carnal mind is enmity against God. It's not subject to God, neither indeed can be. And if people in the kingdom haven't actually developed spiritual minds, if they've just lived under law and been ruled by force and not been converted, when they get a chance, they will break out. But here I think is the most important reason. This rebellion, which may take 50 years to materialise, to organise, develop a military power, is going to be an incredible test for those who have been converted, an incredible test of faith for those who do believe in the God of Israel, who do want to be living forever, who have been converted to have spiritual minds. They're going to be left in a world that is arming themselves to fight the kingdom of God. And just like their brethren who had to fight the Catholic Church down through the centuries, they will have to make a stand against organised and violent forces and be willing passively to put their own lives at peril for their faith. And I think that's the great reason why it happens, because they would have lived almost in perfect conditions, haven't had many chances to demonstrate whether they really are faithful or not. This will be the crunch. Will they join the crowd or will they stay with God? And I think that's perhaps the main reason why there's a rebellion allowed by God. So, that's the end of the rebellion. Verse 11 to 15, we have the second resurrection and the second judgment. The picture is a beautiful one, great white throne, which of course indicates righteousness. One sitting on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven had fled away. So all of the things that man had now set up, when they saw their armies just burned to fire and into crisps, everything that had been set up, they fled away from the face of the King who now reveals himself. No place found for them. No one wants to know. No one was ever part of this rebellion. Everyone flees away now that Christ reveals himself, and the second resurrection takes place. And so we read in verse 13, the sea gave up the dead. These are people who've been lost at sea in the kingdom. Yes, there's still going to be death. Those who are in the grave, Death and the grave delivered up those that were there. And apart from the rebellious armies who have been completely wiped out already, every human being that has lived and died in the kingdom will now be raised from the dead to give an account of themselves before God and before Christ. And they will stand and be judged from the books. Now, the books we are familiar with. There are two books that the Bible describes. Again, symbols for the infallible memory of our God. God's aware of all of our lives, and not one thing does God overlook or not know about. So we have the book of the lives. This is the record that God remembers all of the things that we have done. Apart, of course, he doesn't remember those things that are forgiven. He doesn't bring them up again to us. But he knows the things that are done, both good and bad, in his book. Psalm 56, my tears, are they not in thy book? A book of remembrance was written for those that feared Yahweh and thought upon his name. So there are books of people that have done good things, and God has remembered them. And then there's the book of life, which is the record that only God knows of who will be saved. Names go into the book of life when we're baptised. It's not God's will that we should ever have our name taken out. Even Moses, when he offered for his name to be taken out, was not accepted. All of us, says Paul, have our names in the book of life. And God says, I won't blot your name out of the book of life. I don't want to do that. And it's the same, brethren, as in the kingdom. Those who have lived during the kingdom, God wants them to be in his book of life, but that will have depended upon their faith and their consistency to divine principles. They will be judged, every man, according to his works. So there is the books of life, which indicate the infallible memory of God about the details of our lives, and the list of names that God knows will go in. As with all judgments, it's not for God to find out whether we're suitable for his eternity or not. It's for us to know why God admits us to his kingdom, or maybe why he doesn't. It's for our sake. God says, I know your works already. He knows who's in the book of life. The judgment is about us finding out whether or not we have kept the ways of God as we should. So these books will be revealed. The books were opened and everybody was judged out of the books according to their works. And it says that twice. And then we find in verse 14 and 15, death and the grave are cast into the lake of fire. Now, that literally doesn't make sense. You can't burn death. What that means is there's now a total abolition of the principle of sin and death that has been in the world before. That is the second death. So this is the final destruction of things. The destruction of those who are not in the book of life, in verse 15, they disappear. They join the rebels, they join the Pope, they join the beast. And death joins them as well, because death is now not a thing that will be in the world anymore, because everybody that survives is now immortal. So, flesh is finally gone. And then we move straight into chapter 21. The chapter division is in the wrong place. It should be between verse 8 and 9 of chapter 21. So we're just going to now skim through these 9 verses. They're very simple to understand. In chapter 21, verse 1 to 8, we have a breakup like this. In verse 1 and 2, John sees the new heaven and the new earth. And it's an overview of the end of the process. In verse 3 to 8, he hears a great voice telling him what the composition of the immortals will look like. So let's just take it then. But I want you to notice a little fact in verse 2, which is easy to miss. It says in verse 2, I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And again, you'll find in later on, and I'll just pick it up, in verse 5, the voice on the throne says, behold, I make all things new. We have this double mention of New Jerusalem and things being new. And the newness is different to the start of the kingdom. This is the newness of the things beyond the kingdom. Let's just pick that up, because we saw in our exhortation we did a few weeks ago, verse 9 to 27, we have the description of the saint community, who are described in verse 10 as the holy Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God. So the saints are the first phase. They are a bride when Christ returns. At the end of the millennium, we have a second bride, and we now have New Jerusalem. And there's a difference between those two. Two brides. One is the saints who join with Christ when he comes. The second is everybody that is now immortal at the end of the kingdom. They join with Christ, the angels, the saints, and everybody makes up the New Jerusalem. You see in verse 9 to 27, it is a description of the saint community at the coming of Christ, the first bride. And we know that from verse 24, because their work is to go out to the nations that are being saved. In chapter 22, they are the trees of life that take life-giving water and the healing to the nations. So that the historical section ends in verse 8 of chapter 21. It's the end of the things which must be hereafter. The section from verse 9 onwards is an exhortation to the saints now. The vital principle is that the qualities of the saint community that are glorified as the bride when Christ returns, as the holy city, the holy Jerusalem, the same qualities, the same beliefs, the same principles, the same hope of Israel are the constitution of the New Jerusalem at the end of the 1,000 years. The same salvation, the same beliefs, the same righteousness. But it can only be new at the end of the 1,000 years. And that term, New Jerusalem, applies at the end of the 1,000 years. The name that they'll be given will be a part of New Jerusalem, the final purpose. And that's just a little distinction we need to make, because there are two brides. There's the bride of chapter 19, and there's this bride that now comes down at the end of the 1,000 years. Okay, I hope that hasn't been too confusing. But the newness is the thing that's emphasised. This is a totally new phase of God's plan after the 1,000 years is over. Now, chapter 21 starts off, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Not literal, not a new planet, not a universe. The heavens and the earth indicate the order of things, and particularly the political heavens and the earth that we have seen on this planet. And there are three political heavens that the Bible talks about: the Mosaic, the law of Moses, God dealing with Israel for those 1,500, 2,000 years, the Mosaic era, and the constitution of the law of Moses. That was the heavens and the earth that would be dissolved in AD 70. We then have the heavens and the earth of the millennium, the 1,000 years. And then we have, after the millennium, when God is all in all, the new heavens and the new earth. And you might remember in the 2 Corinthians 12 verse 2, Paul said he was given a vision caught up to the third heaven. He actually saw something that happened beyond the end of the 1,000 years to inspire him to do the work that he had to do. So the heavens and the earth indicate the order of things upon this planet. There was a first heavens and the earth that God created, as we read in the book of Genesis. That lasted until the flood. But there were three political heavens and earths that we deal with in the Bible. So here they are. And so the new heavens and the new earth is the world as it will be after the 1,000 years. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away. That's interesting, isn't it? Well, it's not talking about the law of Moses. When it says the first was passed away, it means the previous one, the millennium, is now passed away. At the end of the 1,000 years, there will not be the laws of the kingdom. There will not be sacrifices. There will not be a priesthood. There will not be a literal temple. All of those things are no longer needed. because everybody is now immortal. And then we're told there was no more sea. Doesn't mean that there will be a planet dried up. What it means is the seas of the nations will no longer exist. There will no longer be the individual nations in the kingdom, not even Israel, because now everybody will be a child of God, an immortal person like the angels. There'll be no more sorrow, no more crying, no more pain, no more sin, no more death, no more mourning at the graves of mortals, because death and the grave have been obliterated. No more sinners, as we read in verse 8. No more liars and deceivers. All of these things will be gone. And those things having been gone at the end of the 1,000 years, things will now happen which are totally different to the kingdom. God can now physically dwell amongst a totally immortal population. As we read in verse 3, God will dwell with them, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. A total unity of the family of God, the angels, the first fruit saints, and the newly immortalised will take place. Look what it says in verse 7. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. You know, what a wonderful thing that is, that God promises to all of those who become part of his eternity. All things will be new. A whole new future awaits God's immortal children as God further expands his glory. I'll make all things new, he says in verse 5. New, different. And we would love to know what the all-in-all period actually involves. But it's not good that we do. We need to focus on, in our case particularly, the coming of Christ and whether or not we go into the kingdom as part of the saints. So there's going to be a lot of changes that come into being. God guarantees that's going to happen. You know, this is the final words of Opus Israel. If you're not familiar with it, it's well worth reading. I find these words quite emotional. Such is the end, when the Son shall deliver up the kingdom to the Father, that God may be all and in all. The separation between God and man began with the transgression of the first Adam. It continues until the end of the 7,000 years, when sin and death are utterly eradicated and harmony again established in this orb of his glorious universe. Thus a population would have been provided for the earth, which instead of being destroyed will be renovated, and all things belonging to it made new. The earth and its inhabitants will be incorruptible, undefiled and unfading. The purpose of God in the formation of the earth will be accomplished, and the headstone of the creation will be brought forth with shoutings, crying, "Grace, grace unto it," which of course is from Zechariah chapter 4. And so, brethren and sisters, Brother Thomas saw that very, very clearly, that the 1,000 years will give so many millions of people upon this earth the chance to really learn about God, not just to live under his laws, but to really learn what he's like. And then to go through the fiery testing of the little season when the rest of the world rises up around them to show whether they have real faith. And if they do, they will join the saints in that immortal nature that will be part of God's work throughout the eternity of the future. It might seem very difficult looking at all these symbols, but brethren and sisters, the storyline is simple. That's where we are going, that's where we hope to be, and we can only, can't we, exercise our minds in the beauty of not just the kingdom, but working with God through eternity in whatever he does after that. So what's needed from us? Well, it's there in verse 6 and 7 of chapter 21. He said unto me, "It is done." In God's mind, this is absolutely certain. When Christ sits upon the throne at the end of the 1,000 years, he will say to his Father, "I have done it. I have finished the work you gave me to do. I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end." And here's the qualification. I will give unto him that is athirst. of the fountain of the water of life freely. And that's what we need to have, brethren and sisters, a thirst to understand the things of God. These are not easy concepts, but they can be understood. We can grow in wisdom and knowledge of these things. And we must really thirst for the time of righteousness to come upon this earth. And we will take that water of life freely to the nations. That we have to overcome ourselves. We have to overcome the world by our faith. He that overcometh shall inherit. You know, inheriting is getting something you didn't work for. You didn't earn, you didn't deserve. You'll inherit all things that Adam lost. And I will be his God, and he shall be my child. Write, the angel said to John, these words are true and faithful.